This is Episode 7 of Ethics and Culture Cast from the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. Welcome to Episode 7 of Ethics and Culture Cast from the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm Ken Hellenius, the Communications Specialist at the Center. In this episode, we sit down with New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, who joined us on campus this past October for a roundtable discussion about Disarming Beauty, the second volume in our book series Catholic Ideas for a Secular World. In our conversation, we talked about his work at the New York Times, the influence of G.K. Chesterton on his own conversion, and the vocation of the Catholic journalist. Let's sit down with Ross for this week's conversation. Well, I'm joined this afternoon by Ross Douthat of the New York Times. Ross joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in April 2009. Previously, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger for TheAtlantic.com. He is the author of Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, published in 2012, and Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class, 2005, and a co-author with Reihan Salam of Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream, in 2008. He is also the film critic for National Review. His column in the Times appears every Wednesday and Sunday. Ross, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you. Well, so the Center for Ethics and Culture here at Notre Dame explores the intersection of faith, primarily within the Catholic intellectual and moral tradition, and public life. We primarily do this within the contours of the academic context, and we strive to elevate discourse and scholarship to a level that considers the role of tradition and practice in the engagement of contemporary issues. Now, at the same time, our emphasis is not on applied ethics, as is often found at other university ethics centers, but ethics and culture, as we consider the way that tradition engages and informs the various means of communication, art, music, literature, etc., as well as politics and the law. So that's a bit about, kind of where we come from. What I'm interested in asking you is, as a Catholic journalist, as someone who works in the media, who writes and analyzes and reflects on many of these same matters in the journalistic context, how might you describe the current scene and your vocation and role in it?
Well, you mean the current media scene, would you say?
Yeah.
I mean, the media scene is very strange these days. We are in an era of, in certain ways, intense media fragmentation. You have a period where sort of traditional institutions, including my own, the New York Times, face all kinds of competitors online and otherwise that they didn't face before. And a lot of the sort of bulwark institutions of the press in the U.S., particularly, I would say, daily newspapers in mid-sized American cities, have just been decimated by the Internet and the way it's changed the landscape of journalism as a commercial enterprise. Yeah. So journalism sort of exists on a very shaky and uncertain commercial foundation right now, which is useful, I think, for understanding the way media companies chase content and do stories and so on. And honestly, a lot of conversation about the media sort of revolves around bias and to what extent does the press have a liberal bias and so on. And then, to what extent does Fox News have a conservative bias?
Yeah. And
round you go. And I think one thing that's useful for outsiders, people who consume media but don't practice it, if you will, non-practicing, is just to sort of recognize that whenever they're engaging with media, they're engaging with reporters, columnists, editors, anchors, and so on, who are in a business that is in many ways much more precarious than the business was 20 or 30 years ago. And that a lot of what goes on in the media, the sort of, up to and including the weird media frenzy around the candidacy of Donald Trump, is partially explained by a business that exists in instability in a way that it hasn't in sort of modern times to the same extent. And that doesn't, get to the question of sort of the ethical element exactly, but it tells you, well, it might tell you why the unethical element in journalism perhaps is a stronger temptation for the media now than it was 20 or 30 years ago in certain ways. There's just a sort of deep uncertainty about what we're doing as an institution and where we're going. I think that informs everybody's work in a sort of confusing kind of way.
Well, what called you to engage in this, especially from, your current platform at the New York Times of all places?
Well, I mean, what called me was that I wanted somebody to pay me to write for a living. I mean, well, seriously, I mean, it's important to recognize that sort of, you're in life, you're looking for a vocation and you're looking for a vocational element in work. But work is also just work. It's a job. And those of us who are fortunate enough or unfortunate enough maybe to work in jobs that involve, a certain amount of intellectual noodling about and so on, also need to recognize that, we are practicing a trade in the same way, in certain ways that, a plumber practices a trade and an auto mechanic practices a trade and so on. You're doing something that you're performing a service that people want to pay for, hopefully. And again, in the current media landscape, maybe less so. But the service that we're performing is trying to explain and comment on, all of the crazy things happening in our politics. But I started out, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I had, like many journalists, ambitions to be a novelist at some point, and those, I have various unfinished novels and short stories on my hard drive somewhere. But what was sort of available as a profession was, magazines and newspapers, and that's where I got my start. And then once you get that start, you sort of you can switch tracks, but once you're on that track, it sort of carries you forward. And so some of the things I write about are things I always knew I would be interested in, including religion, Catholicism, sort of moral and ethical questions. Some of the things I write about, particularly stuff to do with sort of everyday Washington, D.C. politics, are not things that I would have necessarily predicted, but they're sort of where the vocation has carried me. And the nature of being a columnist for the Times is such that you're trying to do two things at once. You have a unique platform and a unique audience. You're writing for one of the most influential papers in the United States, writing for one of the most educated audiences in the United States. And I'm doing it as someone who is a Catholic and some kind of political conservative, so my views are somewhat different from the average New York Times reader and the average Times columnist. So I feel like I have an opportunity and an obligation to try and sort of both try and elevate the conversation and also sort of raise ideas and issues that I don't think necessarily get raised enough at the highest levels of journalism. So there's that, which is clearly that's sort of the clear vocational element of what I do, but it coexists with the imperative to write something interesting twice a week that people want to read. There's only so you can only go so highbrow before you lose your readership, and I'm not really necessarily qualified to go too highbrow. But you also don't want to sort of over melodramatize your own position, right? I mean, people will sort of sometimes treat newspaper columnists like public intellectuals, and maybe we could aspire to that. But we are newspaper columnists, and we write on a sort of passing scene, and you need to have a certain measure of humility about the work that you do. You're sort of providing a weekly service for people that the things you say will be dated, and newspapers before they were digital ended up as birdcage liners usually, and that's you need to recognize that in the landscape of ideas, the life of the mind and so on, what you're doing is trying to inject a little more intellectual seriousness into an enterprise that does end up often as a birdcage liner.
Well, I think of people like G.K. Chesterton, who did, much the same that you're doing. I mean, he commented on all of the things of the day, and as some say, there was never an unpublished thought.
He did not, yes.
Mind. Yeah.
No, and Chesterton, I think Chesterton represents, if he were ever canonized, which he probably should not be, but were he would be the natural patron saint of journalists because he did what we do, right? I mean, he was a journalist, obviously, and he raised journalism in many ways to the highest theological level that you could possibly raise it. But he also had, if you read Chesterton's works, as I have and do, he was instrumental in my own conversion, and I love him to this day. But as a journalist, you can also see the places where you're like, okay, and he's on deadline here, and he has to write something. He's basically like a one-man newspaper at various points in his career, and you can sort of see the difference between that kind of work and the work of the philosopher and the theologian, where you are given, hopefully, by wonderful institutions like this one, more time and space, and you can keep some thoughts unpublished, which is not a grace that's given to all of us who write for a living.
How do you perceive your work being received, both by your direct peers at the Times as well as your readers? Who are your audience? Who is your audience?
That's a good question. I think you have many overlapping audiences, right? You have, in part you write for people in power because people in power do read the New York Times, and so part of my audience is theoretically not so much politicians, but people who work in policy and politics on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, and you are trying to, in a very small way, influence how they think about what policies are possible and advisable and so on. So there's that audience that's sort of specific and elite and narrow. There's the audience of your peers, which matters mostly for vanity and professional advancement, but that does matter. And there I do think it's there are times when you need to sacrifice the respect of your peers in order to take an unpopular position, but sort of taking pride in sacrificing the respect of your peers is a mistake. And even though most of my peers don't agree with me necessarily on a lot of questions, I do think it's a good thing to try and earn their respect in terms of sort of, you want to sort of display the seriousness of your thinking to some extent. To prove, because displaying the seriousness of your thinking is a first step towards getting people who disagree with you to take your ideas seriously. You want them to say, well, I disagree with him, but I can tell he's thinking seriously about this. And so this is true for my peers and also for the many, 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 many readers I write for who, are sort of upper middle class American liberals, sort of secular-ish, who don't share a lot of my basic epistemological commitments. You're not writing to change their mind as the first step. You're writing to persuade them that you might, that your ideas might be worth taking seriously. I think that's a more reasonable goal than trying to change their mind. And then I write for a small but hardy audience that, mostly agrees with me. And, and sometimes you want to just be a champion for that audience and sort of try and elevate their ideas and defend them as vigorously as they can be defended if they deserve to be defended. So you're doing a lot of different things at once, I would say, from where I am, and hopefully I do them somewhat successfully.
If you were to think about, that kind of segmented audience, is there anything you write that you might say is directed toward the nuns? We talk about the rise of the nun. The
spiritual but not religious.
Correct.
Or the post. Yeah, I mean, yes, a certain amount of what I write. So I'll write stuff about sort of intra-Catholic debates, right, where you're sort of trying to describe what's going on in the church, but you're also sort of writing for a Catholic audience and saying, okay, assume Catholicism is true, which side should you take in this church controversy du jour, right? So I do a fair amount of that. But when I write about religion more generally, I'm not trying to make the case for Catholicism or Christianity because that isn't generally appropriate in a newspaper columnist, I think. You're sort of it's more that you're trying to describe the religious landscape in ways that might open people's minds to new or older possibilities that they've sort of discounted or rejected. So I do a lot of columns, not a lot, but a certain number of columns that are sort of describing the strengths and weaknesses of competing worldviews. What does it mean? What are the different forms of post-Christianity? What are their strengths and weaknesses? How do they map and mesh with the sort of historical weak points and strong points of Christianity and the Catholic faith? So I try and do, and some of that can become too sort of disinterested, where you're sort of not taking your own side sufficiently. And I think that's sometimes a danger for me in my position, that you're sort of performing even-handedness in a way in order to prove that you're even-handed in order to get a hearing, but you can do it to an extent where people don't even recognize that you're taking a position. So that can be a problem and a mistake. But in general, I think there's sort of insufficient attention paid in the elite press to different, to sort of theological ideas of all sorts, regardless of whether I agree with them or not. And so I think there is real value in just sort of saying, well, let's try and tease out what are the bedrock theological assumptions of this political worldview, of this cultural worldview, and so on. And I think that is in part addressed to people who are sort of post-Christian, post-Catholic, but still interested in religion and religious ideas, which I think is a big chunk of the Times' readership, and that sort of none category. It's people who are not rejecting religion in full, but just think they've moved beyond or outgrown Christianity somehow.
Do you think some of that is a reaction to the scandals and things, where
it's
the church shoots itself?
It's a reaction to a lot of things, yeah. I mean, I think people drift away from institutional religion for all kinds of reasons. I think that, I think that often what will happen is that scandals and other events and so on will give people permission to do something that they already wanted to do. So you sort of, it's rare. I mean, it happens. There are lots of famous conversion stories and deconversion stories, but it's sociologically rare that people are sort of, Mass every Sunday Catholics 1 month, and then something happens and they just lose their faith. It's much more that you have people who are sort of weakly attached to different religious bodies for whom a scandal or, a political controversy where they feel like the church is on the wrong side, like the same-sex marriage debate, where that then becomes the reason to say, all right, I've sort of partially given this up, and now I'll just give this up completely. So religions lose at the edges, and then they gain at the edges too. So, again, to the extent that I'm trying to sort of persuade people, the person I'm trying to persuade is not the hardened atheist, and it's probably not the person who's drifted fully away from Christianity or Catholicism, but it might be the person who sort of feels some connection, some interest in institutional Christianity, has a lot of doubts and skepticism about it, is sort of amenable to making one small step one way or the other. And again, I think that's all you can hope to influence really as a writer is, it's very rare. You're not writing a column that converts the world. You're writing a column that plants a small seed in someone's mind that affects the choices they make 10 years later or something. And often you're not even doing that, but that's the aspiration, I think. That's the reasonable, limited aspiration for what people in my line of work and vocation do.
What is it that you see the Catholic journalist having to offer the world?
Well, the Catholic journalist can offer a sense that, that the everyday political controversies can be seen, in the light of eternity. It sounds sort of, cliched or pretentious or something, but that's the reality. I think that's what Catholicism or any serious religious faith can bring. I mean, journalism it's a secular profession for a lot of reasons, but part of it has to do with just sort of the nature of the journalistic project. It is an inherently skeptical field where you are going in and sort of, you're always looking for the real story under the official story, and that approach brought to religion lends itself, at the very least, to skepticism about institutional religion, but also just sort of, religious claims generally. The journalist's output is like, well, these people say they believe in these supernatural, fantastical stories, but clearly there must be some, harder thing going on underneath. And I think the religious journalist both has the ability to sort of take religion as it should be taken seriously and say, no, this is these things that people really do believe these things, and there is not always a sort of ulterior, vulgar Marxist materialist cause underneath. And in fact, the beliefs themselves need to be taken seriously because they are, and the beliefs themselves, not just people's self-interest, is what changes and moves and shapes the world. But then you can to step even further back. The journalist can also sort of, take seriously the idea that all of the often sordid and corrupt and chaotic stories that journalists write about are still happening as part of the theater of a world that has meaning, and that that they're part of a larger story that someone is telling, that is not just one damn thing after another. So that's what you offer the world. What you can offer the church is a certain kind of truth-telling that I think is, sometimes can be taken to a fault, but does offer the church a kind of scrutiny that any institution with a hierarchical structure tends to avoid. So, journalists, Catholic and otherwise, did the church a real service. They were sometimes unfair and sometimes wrong, but overall they did the church a real service when it came to the sex abuse crisis. The church needed journalists to do what the bishops and archbishops and cardinals were not doing. And I think that can be true in a lot of cases, that the church needs lay people generally. If the church is going to be governed as it has been governed, if we believe that the way it's governed is, actually ordained by God, then part of the role of the laity in general, and certainly of the journalistic laity, is to sort of check, some of the problems that come in with a hierarchical mode in which you are supposed to believe that bishops are special and that the Pope is special and so on. Those are important and central Catholic beliefs, but that can easily be taken to the extreme of the bishop. It's not just that the Pope is infallible when he speaks ex cathedra, but it's that the bishop is infallible when he tells you not to report your priest who's been abusing a child. And that's where you need checks and you need truth-telling. And I think at its best, Catholic journalism can supply that within the church, telling sometimes hard truths that need to be told.
Question du jour. The Benedict option, disarming beauty, kind of these would be two major kind of lights in this. What next steps might you encourage people of faith to take to engage the wider world, if that's even a recommended goal for these times?
Well, I think it depends on the person. I'm resistant to the idea that we will come up with one model of Christian engagement, whether it's the Benedict option or anything else. And I'm a fan of Rod's book. I'm here at Notre Dame to talk about Father Carrón's Disarming Beauty, which is a fine and beautiful book. But I would just encourage people to recognize that any model is going to be somewhat insufficient, and everybody has to sort of approach things from where they find themselves. And the person who, the Catholic politician has different obligations from the Catholic businessman, who has different obligations from the Catholic parent. There are places where the church needs a Benedictine mode of spirituality, a sort of rebuilding of institutions, a formation of intentional communities. There are places, including probably in journalism, where the church needs a sort of vigorous and creative witness that assumes that actually the world might be open to Catholic ideas. And both are not just possibilities, both are necessities, depending upon where you are. So I think we're in a strange and confused time in the Western world, and nobody's quite sure where we're going religiously, as with everything else. And I think that these kind of books all offer important models for people to internalize and sometimes follow. But it's also important to recognize that what God is calling you to do may not fit perfectly with any particular model, or may fit one model and not another, and it may just depend on where you are and who your neighbors are and what your local parish is like and what you do for a living.
Well, Ross Douthat of the New York Times, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to Ross Douthat. His presentation at the roundtable discussion is on the Center's YouTube channel and linked in the show notes. You can learn more about the Center for Ethics and Culture by visiting ethicscenter.nd.edu. You can subscribe to Ethics and Culture Cast, which is released every other Thursday during the academic year, by visiting ethicscenter.nd.edu/podcast. Please rate us in your podcatcher, and don't forget to tell your friends. Our theme music is I Dunno by Grapes, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution License. We'll see you next time on Ethics and Culture Cast. Until then, make good decisions.